October 23rd, 1956. You are standing in a crowd of 50,000 people on Dózsa György Avenue in Budapest. In front of you, a steel cable has been looped around the neck of Joseph Stalin. All 8 tons of him, cast in bronze, 4 stories tall. Someone has pasted a sign across his bronze mouth. It reads, "Russians, when you run away, don't leave me behind." The crowd is laughing, but nervously, because secret police photographers are moving through the edges of the square, recording faces. 3 weeks ago, this joke could get you arrested. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, Budapest is about to belong to Budapest. The cable goes taut. There is a sound like a ship's cable snapping, and then a roar, not from the statue, but from 50,000 human throats. Stalin hits the pavement. His boots remain on the plinth. Someone runs forward and plants a Hungarian flag in them. This is the story of the next 13 days. Days in which a small country would look the Soviet Empire in the face and make it blink. To understand why 50,000 people tore down a statue in one evening, you have to understand the 11 years that came before. Hungary had been a Soviet satellite since 1949. Its leader, Matthias Rákosi, styled himself Stalin's best pupil. Under him, the secret police, the AVH, arrested, interrogated, and broke somewhere between 1 and 200,000 citizens. Thousands went to forced labor camps. Peasants who refused to hand over grain were beaten on their own kitchen floors. Priests were imprisoned. School children were taught to denounce their parents. And through it all, the country was poor, genuinely, visibly poor. Queues for bread, ration books for sugar. Stalin died in March 1953. 3 months later, a quiet, pipe-smoking reform communist named Imre Nagy became prime minister and began something called the New Course. Nagy closed the labor camps. He stopped the forced collectivization of farms. He released political prisoners. For 22 months, Hungary breathed. And then, in 1955, Moscow pulled him back. Rákosi returned. The prisons refilled, but the lid was beginning to rattle. In February 1956, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech denouncing Stalin. By June, workers in Poznan, Poland, were being shot in the streets for demanding bread and freedom. And in Budapest, at something called the Petőfi Circle, intellectuals were starting to say out loud what everyone had only whispered. By October, the Polish reformer Władysław Gomułka had taken power in Warsaw without Soviet tanks rolling in, and Hungarian students thought, if Warsaw can do it, why can't we? On October 22nd, the students of the Budapest University of Technology wrote down 16 demands: Soviet troops out of Hungary, Imre Nagy back as prime minister, free elections, freedom of the press, the national symbols restored. They decided to march the next afternoon, October 23rd, 1956. They expected 1,000 people. They got 200,000. By 4 in the afternoon, a river of Hungarians was flowing across the Margit Bridge towards the parliament. They chanted, "Ruskik Haza," Russians go home. They carried Hungarian flags with the Soviet-style communist emblem cut out of the center. A hole where the hammer and sickle had been. That flag, with the hole in its heart, would become the symbol of the revolution. At 8 that evening, the party's first secretary, Erno Gero, went on the radio and called the demonstrators nationalists and fascists. It was the worst speech he could possibly have given. A crowd converged on the state radio building on Brody Sandor Street, demanding that the 16 demands be broadcast. A student delegation went inside to negotiate. They did not come out. The AVH opened fire, tear gas, then live rounds. The first Hungarians to die that night were unarmed. And then something extraordinary. Budapest's Hungarian soldiers, policemen, and factory workers began handing their weapons to the demonstrators. The students were no longer alone. The workers of Budapest's 8th, 9th, and 13th districts, the Pesti Srákok, the Pest Kids, had joined them. At 2 in the morning on October the 24th, the Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Zhukov signed the order. For the first time in the history of the Warsaw Pact, Soviet tanks rolled against a member state's capital. 30,000 Soviet troops and 1,000 tanks entered Budapest that morning. But the Soviets discovered something their officers had not been trained for. Budapest is a city of narrow streets, inner courtyards, and tenement rooftops. The T-54 was designed for European battlefields, not stairwells. Teenagers with petrol bottles were destroying Soviet tanks. At one passage called Korvinkurs, a cluster of buildings around a cinema at the corner of Uloy Ut, a group led by a 24-year-old farm worker named Gergely Pongratz would destroy a dozen tanks in 4 days. Someone at Korvinkurs had an idea that became legend. They laid porcelain plates, dinner plates, face down on the road. From the top of a tank turret, in smoke, the plates looked like landmines. For 2 days, Soviet armor refused to drive past them. By October 25th, Bloody Thursday, crowds were flooding back into Kossuth Square in front of the parliament, believing the fighting had stopped. They had brought their children. Soviet tanks were parked around the parliament. Some of the tank crews, seeing the peaceful crowd, climbed down and began to fraternize. Demonstrators draped Hungarian flags over the tank barrels. People took photographs. What happened next has never been fully resolved. At about 10:30 in the morning, fire erupted from multiple directions at once. Snipers on the roof of the Ministry of Agriculture across the square. Soviet tank guns firing from Academia Street. Hungarian border guards firing at ground level. Soviet flares confused everything. The square turned to slaughter. The official register recorded 76 to 88 dead. The British Embassy estimated between 300 and 800. One Hungarian reporter counted 820 bodies at Kerepesi Cemetery the following morning. The best scholarly estimate today is between 800 and 1,000 Hungarians killed in 15 minutes. After Bloody Thursday, sympathy for the revolution crossed an invisible line. A country that had been watching now took sides. On October 28th, Imre Nagy made the broadcast that saved the revolution from being remembered simply as a massacre. He accepted it. He recognized its legitimacy. He announced the dissolution of the secret police, an amnesty for fighters, and the beginning of negotiations for Soviet withdrawal. For 6 days, from October 28th to November 3rd, Hungary was free. 127 newspapers appeared that had not existed the week before. Political parties reformed themselves. Workers' councils were elected in every factory in the country, 2,100 of them, with 28,000 elected members. A Hungarian colonel named Paul Maleta, ordered to take tanks to the Kilian barracks and crush the insurgents, had instead joined them. He was now the military face of the revolution. Nagy made him defense minister. In Budapest's Buda Hills, a 59-year-old truck driver named János Szabó, known to everyone as Szabó Bácsi, Uncle Szabó, commanded a resistance group at Széna tér. He had no military training. He was ambushing Soviet infantry with tactics he had invented on the spot. Cardinal József Mindszenty, imprisoned for 7 years, was freed from house arrest by an armoured unit on October 30th and driven into Budapest a hero. But the same day saw one of the revolution's darkest hours. At Köztársaság tér, Republic Square, armed rebels besieged the Budapest Communist Party headquarters. When the building fell, the defenders, most of them AVH, were dragged into the square. At least 20 were killed, some lynched in full view of international press cameras. The images went around the world. Soviet television broadcast them the same evening as proof that the revolution was a fascist mob. By November 1st, Nagy had made the most radical decision of his life. Hungary was withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. Hungary was declaring itself neutral. Hungary was asking the United Nations for protection. No Soviet satellite had ever done this. None would ever do it again. At the Soviet embassy on Andrassy Út, the ambassador, a 42-year-old careerist named Yuri Andropov was assuring Nagy that the new Soviet troops crossing the border from the east were merely covering the withdrawal. He was lying. Operation Whirlwind was already being planned, and at the same Soviet embassy that evening, Hungary's other major communist, János Kádár, who had been publicly praising the revolution hours earlier, got on a plane to Moscow. He returned on November 4th as the head of a Soviet-installed government that would rule Hungary for the next 32 years. On the evening of November 3rd, Pál Maleta and the Hungarian defense delegation drove to the Soviet base at Tukul, just south of Budapest, for what was supposed to be the final negotiations on troop withdrawal. The talks were going well, coffee was hot, timetables were being drafted, and then at midnight the door opened. The man who walked in was not a negotiator. He was Ivan Serov, chief of the KGB. The Soviet general at the table, Malinin, simply raised his hands, a gesture that meant, "What can I do?" and walked out. Maleta and the entire Hungarian delegation were arrested at the table. Outside the building, at that exact moment, 2,500 Soviet tanks were closing around Budapest. At 3 o'clock in the morning on November 4th, 1956, Soviet armor crossed into Budapest from two directions simultaneously. Down the Soroksári Road from the south, down the Váci Road from the north, across the Chain Bridge and the Margit Bridge into Buda. Headlights off, radio silence. A witness in Buda later said the Chain Bridge looked like a river of steel moving silently. No voices, no chatter, just the sound of machines taking a city. Apartment windows lit up across the city as people woke to the rumble. At 5:20 in the morning, Imre Nagy from the studios of Free Kossuth Radio made his final broadcast. This is Imre Nagy speaking. In the early hours of this morning, Soviet troops attacked our capital with the obvious aim of overthrowing the lawful democratic Hungarian government. Our troops are fighting. The government is in place. I notify the people of our country and the entire world of this fact. Free Kossuth Radio went silent at 7 minutes past 8. It would not broadcast again. 17 Soviet divisions, coordinated under Operation Whirlwind, attacked every district. T-34-85 tanks, T-54 tanks, IS-3 heavy tanks, ISU-152 assault guns. Artillery firing indiscriminately into apartment buildings. On Sheppel Island, home to Hungary's largest steelworks, the artillery bombardment was heaviest. Soviet tanks fired into residential buildings at point-blank range. At Corvin-Köz, Pongratz's fighters held out for 5 more days, their cellars filled with 200 wounded. A 24-year-old medical student named Ilona Toth ran a field hospital at Péterfi Street, treating wounded, printing revolutionary leaflets in the basement. A 15-year-old boy named Peter Mansfeld was fighting with a borrowed rifle in the 2nd District. The commander of the Tűzoltó Street resistance was a 28-year-old Auschwitz survivor, István Angyal, a committed socialist who had joined the revolution because he believed Soviet domination had betrayed socialism itself. And somewhere in the streets, a 15-year-old girl named Erika Cornelia Seles, auburn hair, a submachine gun too large for her frame, had her picture taken by a Danish photographer. The image would be printed on front pages across the free world. A few days later, Erika put down her weapon and put on a Red Cross armband. A wounded boy was lying in the street. She ran out to help him, hands visible. She was 15 years old when Soviet machine gun fire killed her. Armed resistance ended around November 11th, but something else continued. In the weeks that followed, 200,000 Hungarians fled across the Austrian border. It was the largest mass refugee movement in Europe since the end of the Second World War. 180,000 reached Austria, another 18,000 crossed into Yugoslavia. The United States, whose annual immigration quota for Hungarians was 865 people, accepted 38,000. But the resistance that lasted longest was not armed. On November 14th, 10 days after the invasion, the Greater Budapest Workers' Council was founded. 28,000 elected delegates from 2,100 factories across Hungary. For 5 more weeks, they called general strikes that paralyzed the country. Kadar's government could not restart production without them. The last Workers' Council was only abolished in the summer of 1957, 10 months after the revolution had officially been crushed. Imre Nagy had taken asylum in the Yugoslav embassy on November 4th. He was lured out later that month under false Soviet guarantees of safe passage. He was held in Romania, brought back for a secret trial. Hanged on June 16, 1958. Paul Maleta was hanged the same morning. István Angyal, the Auschwitz survivor, was executed that December. Peter Mansfeld was 15 during the revolution. The Hungarian state waited until 11 days after his 18th birthday to hang him on March the 21st, 1959. On November 4th, as Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, Cardinal Mindszenty walked into the United States Embassy on Szabadság tér and asked for asylum. He did not leave the building for 15 years. He died in Vienna in 1975. He never saw Hungary again. Between December 1956 and the summer of 1961, 341 Hungarians were executed for what they had done in those 13 days. 22,000 were sentenced. 13,000 were imprisoned, as many as during the darkest years of the Rákóczi terror. Imre Nagy's body was buried face down in an unmarked grave at plot 301 in the new public cemetery. He was reburied with full honours in front of 250,000 mourners on June 16, 1989. 4 months later, Hungary was free. In 13 days, in October and November of 1956, a small Central European country looked the Soviet Empire in the face. The Empire won. Of course it won. It had 17 divisions and 4,000 tanks. But 33 years later, one human lifetime, one generation of mothers remembering sons, the empire was gone and Hungary was still standing. That's the strange, stubborn logic of history. Tanks win battles, memory wins countries. For more stories from behind the Iron Curtain, subscribe.